Hello and welcome to AI Curious. My name is Jeff Wilser. I'm a journalist, I'm a human, and I am curious about AI. Now, the very first episode of this podcast was about AI in Hollywood. It's a subject I am fascinated by because there's so much both potential and excitement for how AI can be used to make making movies easier, and also extreme fear and uncertainty and legitimate concerns that AI will take jobs and will render artists and graphic designers' roles obsolete. Things are both legit takes about AI, the upside and the downside. And Hollywood, of course, is only one swath of the various ways AI can impact creativity, whether writers, painters, photographers, on and on. And at the heart of this is the issue of IP, is how can we protect our creations? Does AI have a claim to creating its own IP? And then when creations are used as inputs for training models, how can those creators be compensated? Is it even consensual, right? There's an issue where book authors have objected to their books being used to feed the massive ocean of data that trains OpenAI's models, for example. And I personally had a couple of books on that list that were used to train AI. Do I have a right to be upset about that? Do I have a right to be compensated? There's a lawsuit, of course, right now from the New York Times about issues in this space. Also, that's my puppy. If you hear any strange noises, my puppy Mojo is trying desperately to make a cameo on this podcast. He really enjoys the content and he wants to be a featured guest sometime. We'll settle for a little small cameo right now with some weird noises. Anyway, I'm sure AI will fix that in the future. Point is that IP and how AI will be used or not used by Hollywood and all the creatives is one of the most burning questions. It's a problem that doesn't seem to have any clear answers or solutions, except there is a team that thinks they have an actual real solution for all of this. And that is our guest today, the very brilliant, very engaging Jason Zhao, co-founder of a project called Story Protocol. Now, Story Protocol, frankly, has already have a decent amount of heat. And in my book, Justified, there was a piece in Variety written about them. They have raised a bit of a war chest, including $54 million of capital from investors like A16Z and Endeavor. And they are effectively building an infrastructure that attempts to solve the issue of AI and IP by effectively creating a network or a marketplace where creators can set up the terms for letting their IP be used for others in use of AI. So Jason walks through a lot of examples in our conversation, such as maybe J.K. Rowling says, hey, if you want to use Harry Potter as an input for AI, you can. And she can set terms of what you can do, what you can't do. And then on the back end, J.K. Rowling would get a cut of this. The project is not just theoretical in the whiteboard phase. They have a team building us right now. There are real players in Hollywood that are getting involved with this, such as David S. Goyer is one of their advisors. Goyer, of course, is the screenwriter for The Dark Knight. And they clearly have some tailwinds here. There's some energy behind what they are doing. Of course, there are a lot of complications, a lot of challenges to overcome. And Jason and I we walk through all those things. I actually had the pleasure and honor of introducing Jason to the AI summits back in Austin at the Consensus Conference last month. It was a blast. He gave a presentation to the crowd. I asked some follow-up questions, all that good stuff. And there seems to be some real excitement here. I think there are a lot of folks in the decentralized AI and blockchain and AI world that see a lot of promise. I recorded an episode a few weeks back about ways that, in theory, crypto and AI could work together. And as I mentioned then, this is not just pie in the sky theoretical. There are projects actively working to build to try and leverage the best parts of blockchain tech and make that work for AI. And we don't go too deep into the kind of blockchain, Web3, crypto angle here. We do touch upon it. Jason kind of walks through the basics. But essentially, blockchain is really good as a tool for tracing things, for auditing things. And one of the biggest problems in AI right now is it's hard to trace. It's hard to figure out how the outputs get from the inputs. So this is oversimplifying a bit, but this infrastructure that Story Protocol is building helps create this traceable piping system where we can see what's happening with the AI. And again, Jason covers that far more eloquently in our conversation. And he has a good knack for taking extremely complex topics and making them easy to follow. This is a really fun conversation. We cover at both a theoretical and practical level the current challenges and problems of AI in Hollywood and IP in Hollywood, kind of how the system is broken, how this broken system is affecting things on a day-to-day basis. And then Jason walks through this possible solution of what would a system look like that can create effectively this IP network or IP marketplace that kind of lets people, and the upside is, once you solve this issue, it lets people create with AI with more confidence. In theory, there's a world where creators get compensated if folks use their work for AI. And then conversely, people might be more emboldened to create things if they know it's not being done on the backs of plagiarized works. So please enjoy a conversation with Jason Zhao, co-founder of Story Protocol. Jason, welcome to the pod.
Hey, Jeff, thanks for having me.
So the presentation you gave at Consensus, which was a banger, by the way, and again, I encourage listeners to check that out in the show notes. You asked a question. You asked, why aren't we living in a digital renaissance? And I'm going to ask you that same question now. What do you mean by that? Why do you think we should be living digital renaissance, and what's holding us back from that?
Absolutely. So the premise of this question, and it's really the premise that has animated a lot of my work on Story, which is the company I'm a co-founder of. It's a real perplexity. And when you look at just the number of resources that creators have, it suggests that if you're an alien coming from Mars, and I told you today, there's two things that creators have. One, creators have the ability to reach a global audience through social media, through the internet. I can go on TikTok, record a video, send it out, and have 10 million people view it in a single day if it goes viral. Number two, not only do I have global distribution through the internet and through these social media networks, I also have the ability to create godlike high quality content through AI. And this is not just in prose, this is not just in images, but it's also even in videos with OpenAI Sora model and other latest developments. So I can create a screenplay using a single sentence and then take that screenplay that an AI generated and then feed it into another AI to create a film. 10-minute short film at the same quality or near that quality of a Hollywood studio, right? So, I'm an alien from Mars and I'm looking at human creators and I'm thinking, wow, they can reach anyone on the planet with just a single prompt and at qualities that have been, unprecedented and just months ago only available to, the very top of the top in LA. And that's what we're working with. That's what creators and everyone really on the internet has access to, regardless of whether you're professional or not. So that would suggest that things are going great for creators. It means there's more creators. It means that they're producing more content. It means that creativity should be flourishing. But if you look around, especially even in the highest ranks of creators in Hollywood, they went on strike for 6 months out of the year in 2023, right? Not just writers, but also actors. And if you look everywhere else on digital platforms, they're very, very struggling to monetize. The business model of creativity doesn't really exist. And so that's what we mean by why aren't we living in the digital renaissance? Because everything suggests that we have the technology and the tools to have godlike distribution and godlike quality in our content, but yet at the same time, creators are struggling now more than ever. So the question is why.
And you mentioned the strike. I'd love to go there now. I think that there's almost, it strikes me as almost like there's two buckets of problems. There's why aren't more creators creating even more and better output given the tech we have? And the second question, related question, is how even the baseline we had prior to the last 2 years of AI development feels in jeopardy, right? So even forgetting the potential extra amazing work that's not happening, I think the concern is whatever baseline level of creativity humanity has had in the pre-AI era, that all feels at risk now, right? Like Hollywood writers are worried they can't make a living anymore. And there's a variety of reasons beyond AI, but AI is clearly a big part of it, right? There's so many creators are concerned about how AI will impact their livelihood. So how would you characterize the root cause of that problem from the lens of IP and how AI complicates IP and the problems with the infrastructure and landscape of IP that exists today?
Absolutely. So to me, there's many different problems, but there's three high level areas where I think a lot of this friction and a lot of these issues that relate to the lack of a digital renaissance come up. And the first area is in the ever increasing abundance or exponentially increasing abundance of high quality content on the internet. So let me break that down, because at first that sounds like a great thing. Like all this great content on the internet, people can
There's a
consume.
renaissance.
There's a
You're
renaissance,
saying it's
right?
not here, but it's
Right.
here. Yeah.
That's what it looks like on the surface, right? It's like this sort of duck syndrome where you can see the duck above the water and it looks very peaceful, but then underneath, all the flapping is happening. And what's happening is, this could be good for creators or for consumers because there is a lot more content. But if you're a creator, there is so much competition for attention. And just put yourself in the shoes of a Netflix executive. You create a new AAA show on Netflix, it launches, and all of a sudden it's competing for attention with every other show on Netflix. It's not only competing with your own shows, it's also competing with Amazon Prime, Apple TV. It's also competing with
Mhm.
TikTok and YouTube and even with sleep, right? So there's a limited amount of attention in the world and a lot of content. And these tools actually make that sort of traffic jam worse from the creator's perspective. So if you look at Hollywood and some of the problems they've had with compensating creators, it's not because there's greedy studios that are trying to take every single penny away from the creators. It's actually just a reality of the market when you have ever increasing customer acquisition costs because the landscape for attention is so competitive. It means every dollar you earn off that new show as a Netflix executive, you need to funnel 99 cents back into advertising to capture attention from everything else that you're competing with. And that's only going to get worse as more and more people create awesome content, right? So it's only going to get more competitive. And so the margins, let's say, are going to get squeezed even more, and attention's going to become more expensive, meaning less goes to the creators.
Mhm.
So that's problem number one. We don't really have a way to address this ever rising customer acquisition cost problem. The second,
And just jump in real
yeah,
quick. Just jump in real quick. This is kind of a problem regardless of AI, right? So this has been
yes,
a media landscape problem that, and part of it too is goes back to macroeconomic issues like interest rates, right? Like 3, 4, 5 years ago, in the era of free capital, you had all the big players, whether Netflix, Amazon, Apple, putting all these chips on the table in this race, to mix metaphors, to like get better content, right? Because the content is king. So we're like, whatever, we're going to invest all this money on making a big new Lord of the Rings series. We're going to invest on finding the next Game of Thrones. There's more and more shows, and you have literally thousands of shows out there that no one can keep track of, much less watch. So to your point, this is a larger problem than just AI, but it still
absolutely.
adds to the mix. Yeah, yeah.
Absolutely. And
Go
I
on. So
think, as you
what's
said, AI just makes that problem worse, right? And
yes.
I'm not saying that we should limit creativity, but it's just a consequence of the fact that AI allows anyone to be a creator, a high quality creator, just means that everyone has to participate in a more in a tighter struggle and more competition for attention.
So what's root cause number two?
So root cause number two is related, and it's the idea that fans and anyone who can be considered a community member of content is really pushed out to the side. So what we're seeing is there's an opportunity to solve problem number one, but it's not being taken. The opportunity is, instead of treating IP as a silo and each company owning an IP and just paying tons and tons of advertising to get attention, what if we could turn IP into a network? What if IP could have the same network effects as Facebook? Because if you look at Facebook, why doesn't Facebook or these other social platforms, why don't have the same problems as content? It's because Facebook grows in value as more and more people use Facebook. So it advertises itself, and that's the definition of a network effect. What if IP could do that? The way to do that would be to invite fans of an IP to have skin in the game, to be able to not only contribute, but be rewarded for their contributions to an IP. So that now you have not only built-in creativity from all this user-generated content, you also have a flywheel where those people are incentivized to market and evangelize your content. So as more and more people contribute and get rewarded, your IP becomes easier and easier to market. That would solve problem number one, and that's what we're trying to do at Story. But that's not what Hollywood and a lot of other consumer platforms are trying to do. So problem number two is that you have tons and tons of latent fan interest. If you look at 3 of the top 100 most trafficked websites are fan fiction websites, and they have the AO3.org. It has the Craigslist UI. It's really just a crappy UI, to be honest. But there's so much content and there's so much enthusiasm. But right now, fan fiction is almost a bad word. It's like definitionally you're being pushed out to the side where all the fans go and they just create content that only fans read, and then the canon is over here sitting on a high perch, struggling to monetize, right? So we think that there's a real issue where the fans aren't really brought in to contribute to the network. They're sort of left out.
Awesome. And we'll unpack that further in a bit, but what's the third problem in your eyes of how this is happening?
Yeah, and the third problem is really uniquely related to AI. AI obviously supercharges some elements of the first problem, but really the third problem is that you're starting to see a lot of tension when it comes to this new technology that enables anyone to create, colliding with, I would say, a very, very old and almost medieval copyright and IP regime. And I'll give some specific examples of those tensions and those cracks starting to show. First and foremost, you've seen the OpenAI just release a new model, and the voice sounds a lot like Scarlett Johansson. And in fact, there's reason to believe that maybe it was inspired by Scarlett Johansson's voice directly, right? And so obviously, Scarlett Johansson was very vocal about her voice being used. And so you're seeing, how do you determine the boundaries between people's IP as a creator? And then also you're seeing this happen in journalism where the New York Times has actually gone out and sued ChatGPT for spitting out things that are behind their paywall verbatim to ChatGPT users.
And just to jump in real quick on this one, I think it's such a gray area, right? Because I can see arguments going back to Scarlett Johansson, kind of iconic example now. On the surface, it sounds really sketchy, right? Like Sam Altman even tweeted, to your point, he tweeted her
right
during the demonstration of his tech, clearly making an allusion to the Scarlett Johansson film and the inspiration for this voice, yet also assuming they did not explicitly train the model and the voice on Scarlett Johansson. And if we can take them at their word, they use some other actress, an actual human being who happens to have a voice an awful lot like Scarlett Johansson's. Is that wrong to use some voice that sounds an actual human being's real voice who consents to have her voice serve as the model for the AI voice that happens to sound like if someone happens to have a voice like mine and OpenAI decided for whatever reason to train an AI model based on this person whose voice is like Jeff's, do I have the right to slap them in the wrist, say it sounds an awful like me? So it's to your point about how this copyright and IP stuff is stuck in the Middle Ages. These are kind of complex problems that lawyers are racing to figure out right now that I don't think there are exactly clean black and white solutions.
Absolutely. And, let me maybe lay out sort of the stark, naive picture as I see it, and sort of like the bad version of the world I think that we're living in right now, and the maybe better version of the world we could be living in. And then I think fair use is an interesting concept. So I'll kind of talk about how that complicates those visions. So I think what we talked about with just now with New York Times and Scarlett Johansson, like that's clearly, there's clearly issues, right? Like maybe there's some fair use there, maybe there's some gray areas, but like what I would describe this structurally is a lose-lose situation, right? So let's just say I'm J.K. Rowling, I've created Harry Potter, it's very popular. Clearly, people are going to create Harry Potter videos. I mean, it's inevitable, right? Like it's inevitable that people are going to, and people have created like Harry Potter in the style of Balenciaga, Harry Potter if Wes Anderson was the director, right? And these things are getting tens of millions of views on YouTube, but it's a lose-lose situation because I'm not earning anything if I'm J.K. Rowling. And if I'm a fan that just spent like 3 days creating this script for this and fine tuning the model, whatever, I might get a cease and desist, right? And so you have we lose the situation where no one's really earning from this. And what people are trying to do is play whack-a-mole with the internet. So Warner Bros. Trying to cease and desist people using Drake's voice. You can do that in the beginning, but AI, I think, is both illegal right now and inevitable. And so we need to find a way to reconcile that and turn it into a win-win situation. So I think, to move from the current world where it's a little lose-lose and antagonistic between creators and remixers, what if there was a win-win situation between creators and remixers? What if J.K. Rowling could, put some of the IP that she wants other people to remix? Maybe it's this specific cartoon version of Harry Potter, and people can actually use that asset and create videos. And if they earn, let's say, $10,000 on YouTube ads from that remix, then maybe J.K. Rowling gets 9,000. And so now you have a situation where people are spreading Harry Potter. They're growing the IP on behalf of J.K. Rowling. She's earning a cut of the revenues. But also, if you're a remixer, you get to take advantage of the best IPs in the world and be a part of that and also earn for your contributions, right? So that's the win-win situation that I think would allow IP to turn into a network. And that would solve the first two problems around attention scarcity and also fans being left out of the picture. And also provide a solution to the third, which is how do we solve some of the murky issues around IP and AI? But now to address, the very good question you asked around fair use, I think I'm not a lawyer myself, and it's certainly complicated. But what I will say is, even if all of this is fair use, right? Let's just assume the strongest position for OpenAI or Sam Altman in this situation. Let's take the stance that all of it is fair use. Like I just recreated a voice that sounded exactly like Scarlett Johansson, but it wasn't Scarlett Johansson's voice because I never actually trained on her voice, right? Like that's probably the strongest arguments if we accept that on behalf of OpenAI. But what would be more interesting and more valuable for both Scarlett Johansson and OpenAI, even assuming that to be the case, would be if there was a sort of blue check mark that said, this is actually Scarlett Johansson approved, right? And like many, many
And
more
the
people
pre-Elon Musk blue check mark, the blue check mark pre-Elon Musk, the one that
pre-Elon
actually means
Musk blue
something,
check mark, yes.
not you spend $8 a month to get the blue check mark.
That's
But
right. That's right.
go on.
Now
Yeah.
we had to specify. I need to find a new analogy. But yes, the pre-Elon blue check mark. Imagine if I were Drake, maybe I just accept that people can use my voice and that's fair use. Maybe that's the case, right? Like that. I don't think that's always the case, but let's just assume for the sake of argument. But wouldn't it be better if I could, people could pay, Drake a certain sum or a certain revenue share to have a blue check mark, so to speak, right? And so on Spotify, I could see, okay, there's 10 Drake remixes using his voice, but then this one like was approved by Drake. That one is going to get a lot more attention, and that one's going to be a lot better. So as AI scales, even if all of it is fair use, creators are still going to be able to have this win-win situation if they can monetize authenticity, if they can monetize their approval, if they can extend almost a version of themselves throughout digital space, right? And so that's, I think, even in the strongest fair use argument, you can still pull out how this would be a win-win situation if artists had the ability to create this relationship with people remixing, because that blue check mark is then the carrier value. The voice maybe is out there. Maybe it's all fair use. I mean, I don't think that's the case, but even if it were, that blue check mark still carries a lot of value.
Interesting. That's a great way to describe it. You've already teased a bit on the solutions, and we'll definitely go there in more detail soon. Before we do, I'd love to hear a little more about how you see the lay of the land of the IP problem. You've been in the space for a minute now. What of the various verticals, if you will, between Hollywood movies, books, individual TikTok creators, newspapers, what do you see as the most vexing, challenging creator IP problems? I mean, I know that it's kind of all of the above, but is there a particular industry or type of creation that you see as especially difficult and you're eager to help solve these problems? Or an industry like, actually, this one, they've got it figured out pretty well?
Yeah, this is a really good question. Maybe I'll give a high level answer that doesn't
Sure.
directly answer your question, and then we could dive deeper into specific verticals. But just to kind of, you asked about the lay of the land of IP in general, and I think IP is sort of a nebulous concept, and I just wanted to clarify, how we see IP at Story and sort of what IP like at a first principle level means. And so, IP is obviously a form of intellectual property, right? That's what it stands for, and it's a subset of property in general. But the thing that makes IP unique and interesting is that unlike physical property, which is naturally scarce and therefore naturally accrues value, right? Think about a beachside property. If I have this stretch of beach, there's maybe only 5 mansions that can be built alongside the beach. And so, of course, people are going to compete to have one of those houses and have the best view. That's naturally scarce. You can only build so many houses, right? Whereas you think about ideas, I mean, Jeff, if I told you a great idea and you started implementing it and then you started telling all your friends, I mean, everyone can use that idea. It's not like the idea gets used up and then disappears forever, like a spell or something, right? In
Right.
like a wizard
Right.
game. And so IP or ideas is naturally abundant. There's no natural scarcity. And so you need to inject artificial scarcity into this natural abundance. And that's how you get intellectual property. And if you look at the history of IP, like this concept was only invented after the Gutenberg press was invented. Because once you had the printing press, you had the ability to mechanically reproduce content at scale, right? And before that existed, it wasn't really a problem, IP theft, because, ideas, of course, they're abundant, but it's very hard to tell someone an idea like in the form of a book, and they'd have to copy it manually, right, to just like transport it. And so when you had mechanical reproduction, that meant that creators didn't really have an incentive to create without the invention of IP, because if anyone could reproduce their work en masse, then if I'm a creator, someone else just gets one copy of my book and then starts printing it out, and they're making money and I'm not, then there's no incentive to create, right? So IP is fundamentally about injecting scarcity in order to incentivize creators. And what we're seeing now, and this goes back to the idea of IP being in the medieval era, is that the same copyright laws that we were using in the Gutenberg press era hundreds of years ago are still being applied to social media and AI today. And that's where the problem lies. And that's where we're trying to create, a story like a programmable IP layer that is internet native, that does move at the speed and scale of the internet. And to your question of, like where would be the most promising places to start when it comes to taking advantage of this programmable IP
Yep.
layer, this sort of response to updating the Gutenberg press era, I actually think it's not going to look a lot like any of the existing verticals. And what I mean by that is, I think this is such a fundamentally new way of thinking about content creation that it's going to be fundamentally multimedia, and it's going to be fundamentally dispersed and decentralized. And a lot of these franchises will look more like sort of Wikipedia style growth, where you have people creating new characters, adding lore to existing characters, adding an image to some lore, adding a soundtrack to that story along with the image. I mean, it's going to look almost incomprehensible. And the reason why I believe that is because, number one, our IP systems are so outdated, it forces us to sort of act in these silos of music and games and arts. And so it's almost like fundamentally siloed by design, but it doesn't have to be structured that way. And if you look at, content businesses in general, like think about YouTube, they didn't really go after an existing medium, right? If you ask like, what is YouTube going to disrupt music? I mean, yes, it ends up disrupting music. Is YouTube going to disrupt film? Yes, it ended up disrupting film, but not by going after Steven Spielberg, not by inviting Steven Spielberg to make the first video on YouTube, by actually empowering like a new class of creators that was completely neglected by the previous system, like the Mr. Beasts of the world, the Nigahigas of the world, the Smoshes of the world. Like those people were not empowered and didn't have a voice in the previous system, and they were the ones that created YouTube. So like similarly with story and with what we're building in this new era of IP that's networks, I think it's going to look pretty foreign. Like it's going to look like as weird as home videos looked, in the beginning of YouTube.
I love that. Let's go there now. By the way, that was the most lucid description of IP I've ever heard anyone give, including lawyers. Maybe you should be. I'm sure you have plenty of time on your hands as a co-founder. You need to be a lawyer as a side hustle. So that was great. I'd love, and you kind of tease on the big picture ideas of building this kind of IP network or even marketplace. It sounds like. Talk a little more about how Story Protocol works, what the infrastructure is that you're building. And then I'd love to hear specifically, how would it look from the perspective of an average creator? And then I'm asking 9 questions at once. How could it look from the perspective of like Hollywood, right? How has this changed in theory in 5 years when this breaks the way you want it to break and things, it actually all works? There's adoption. What does the world look like from Warner Brothers' point of view, right? So that's what we're going to head to on this, but let's start with the basics. Tell me what Story Protocol is and how it works.
Yeah, so Story Protocol is a company that I've been working on for the past few years, and our mission is to essentially make IP programmable. And programmability is sort of sometimes an abstract concept. So just to make it even more concise, I would say what we're really trying to do is make intellectual property multiplayer, right? And we talked about these three problems in IP: the content congestion problem, the content traffic problem, lack of attention, problem number one. Problem number two is that IP is siloed, that fans are left out, they're not being harnessed, and then the third is this sort of AI copyright issue, right? And I think Story really like provides a fundamental infrastructure layer that reimagines how IP can work, and solves all those problems. And the way we do that is by allowing IPs to become sort of like Lego building blocks. So imagine any character, any song, any comic, right? Any film, really any creative medium, it can be registered on Story into our universal media library. So all of the content, our vision is all of the content on the internet, creative content, is registered on Story. And why that's important is because as creators or platforms are registering this IP, they can set the rules for how that IP can engage with other IPs, right? So just like different Lego blocks can fit into each other, you can say as a creator, look, here's my character that I just made on this app that's integrated with Story, and I want anyone to be able to use my character as long as they pay me $100 upfront, and if they make revenue, they can share 50% of the revenues with me, right? And so you have essentially what is an API for rights around every single piece of content on the internet that turns that IP multiplayer, that allows it to be a Lego in someone else's creation, and allows it to grow in almost a networked way. So you can imagine, just like open source, if you look at GitHub visualization, like Linux grows like in a graph like way with contributions over time. Imagine if
Mm-hmm.
your character could have its own graph. Someone creates a song around it, someone creates a comic, that comic becomes a movie, and you have
Or
this
back to
graph.
J.K. Rowling's example, right? Back to J.K. Rowling. The idea is like she could register Harry Potter and Hogwarts, whatever, all of her IP in the Story, and anyone can go create their own AI injected fan fiction and do whatever they want with it.
Right,
And
right.
presumably, would J.K. Rowling or other creators in your model, do they have the ability to add guardrails and have limitations? Because they might say, "Whoa, I'm pretty protective of this brand. My Harry Potter can't have two heads," or I don't want Harry Potter in your fan fiction worlds to be secretly evil and lop off the head of Dumbledore, right? So
Right, right, right.
are there ways that the creators can kind of put some brand safeguards, or is it a free for all and we'll just see what see what
Absolutely. No,
happens?
that's super important to us, right? Because creators have different risk tolerances and they have different goals. And so all the way from super liberal like CC0, where you have zero commercial rights attached to it, it's basically public domain. You can do that on Story. You can set your terms in that way. Or if you're Disney or JK Rowling, you're an established player, like you can make it very, very restrictive, or at least very, very safe, and have a lot of stipulations for how people can use your IP, right? So it's not just economically, like maybe it's really expensive, or maybe you have to you have to achieve a certain amount of things or have a certain profile. Like you can filter people out, right? And so the idea is to give creators the tools to allow their communities to use the IP that they want them to. And we think that this is going to be a competitive landscape where, look, maybe Disney is very restrictive and JK Rowling is very restrictive, but for whatever reason, and like if the ones that are more open, they actually gain more traction because more people are contributing to them. Over time, there will be this almost like Darwinian filtering of the best strategies, right? And so we'll see. This is what I mean. Like you'll see new ways of building IP. Some will be more or less successful, and the ones that are more successful, more and more people will adopt over time.
Jason, if I'm hearing you right, this is larger even than AI in a sense that if this vision is fully realized, creating an IP marketplace could unlock possibilities where different institutions could have more creative ways of sharing and dealing with the IP. I'm going to make a very nerdy example, and this might be extreme. Maybe this is way outside the scope of what you're building. I'm going to throw this out there and you can react to it. Think about Marvel and Disney, or sorry, Marvel and DC, right? There's the MCU, as everyone knows, and there's the world of Superman and Batman. And for all of eternity, these two worlds shall never meet, right? We have Spider-Man and Iron Man and Captain America over here. You have Superman and Batman over here. And barring maybe there was in the 70s some totally rando crossover rare comic book that deep cut nerds might know about. But generally, two different worlds. In theory, is your infrastructure letting people register IP in this network, in this marketplace? And there would be very complicated rules around how it could be used. But in theory, DC could set the terms for anyone could use Superman, and maybe Kevin Feige over at Marvel says, cool, sure, we'll pay $1 billion to let Superman join the multiverse and appear in Avengers 7. Right? Is that the kind of thing in theory that could be possible with this IP infrastructure and network? And if not, let me know kind of where the scope ends and what it's intended for.
No, that's exactly right. And, as you were asking for examples, those are exactly the examples I was going to give, which is if you look at where the world is trending, right? I'll give 3 specific examples. The first is Avengers. You already called it out. Like, it's such a popular franchise. You have to say it's probably one of the most successful franchises at the box office for the past decade. And the reason why is because it uses IP Legos, right? Without, explicitly saying it, you're taking characters that have been developed in their own independent comic series for decades and bringing them together into this world, right? And that's really exciting. And same thing with Smash Bros. In gaming, right? Like Super Smash Bros, Mario Kart, it's the same thing. You can use Toad, you can use Sonic. There's so many different characters that you can engage with. So what if, right? Like the way that they do that now is they have teams of lawyers that are individually negotiating with Sega or, some other, with other IP holders to bring them in. And that's very painful. Every time they make a new game, they have to do that. And that's why only the biggest studios have access to create these sorts of games and these sorts of content. But what if if you wanted 5 different characters for an adventure style film, you click 5 buttons, right, on story. Boom, you have the ability to create a comic or a film with all 5. If you wanted to create the next Smash Bros, you click 30 buttons. Now you have all the characters that you need, and the revenue sharing is automated, and we'll take care of all that for you. That's sort of, we are trying to basically turn code into law and law into code, so that with the ease of expression and the simplicity and scalability of software, you can do legal things without even thinking about the law, right? In the same way that when you go on Stripe, you just put in your credit card, you press a button, and like the entire global financial system just happens. Same thing for us with the legal system. Like imagine if you just click a button and things just happen based on the terms that people have set. That's the goal. And I think that's, the relationship with AI is twofold. One is that as AI comes on board, as we talked about, so many people are going to become creators. I actually think everyone will become a creator. Like there is no reason if you can create by typing in a single sentence of Hollywood length video or film, Hollywood quality film, everyone's going to become a creator. And that means everyone's going to be able to remix and everyone's going to want to remix. So how are we going to actually track and make sure that people are remixing in a way that's win-win at the speed and scale of the internet? It's not by everyone hiring a lawyer, right? Like that's not scalable. Everyone's not doing one-to-one legal deals and pen and paper and kind of following up with people to figure out whether they paid them. Like that doesn't work. It's by having this underlying IP infrastructure that solves the monetization problem for AI. And we actually think like that's the real problem in AI right now, in generative AI. It's not speed, it's not performance. Like those will continue to improve, but the net new unlock that I think hasn't been discovered at all yet is how do you actually monetize this at scale, and how do you allow IPs to grow in a networked way?
I love your phrase, turning law into code and code into law. That makes me think, of course, about smart contracts. So can you share, without getting too deep into weeds of crypto land, talk a bit about how blockchain is enabling this tech and this infrastructure, kind of high level how it works?
Yeah, so 2 levels of explanation. The first is more abstract based on the kind of definition I gave of intellectual property. If intellectual property is truly about, like I said, injecting scarcity where there's no natural scarcity, where there's actually only natural abundance, then clearly AI is making content more and more abundant. We've already talked about that. So how do we make something like as abundant as content in the world of AI scarce, right? Scarce in the way that creators can actually monetize off of it. Blockchain, we believe, as a technology, provides provable scarcity. And you've started to see this already with NFTs. Like people describe NFTs as digital property, right? Because yes, I can right click save as any image on the internet and copy it for free, right? But there's only going to be one original token that represents that image, right? And so in the same way, we think, the reason why Story uses blockchain is because we want to store IP on chain, because in this world of infinite abundance on the internet, blockchains provide provable commitments about scarcity. And that's really, really key. in order to accrue value, and that
Yep.
drives incentives for creators, right? More in more detail, like what we're doing with smart contracts, which are essentially just programs that run on the blockchain. What we're doing is two things. One is we have what we call nouns, and the other is what we call verbs. So nouns are basically, just a representation of how we store IP on chain. We're basically trying to create one single standard for how IP is defined on chain, so that you don't have to get a lawyer to translate this license with that license or this IP with that IP. You can kind of just have one single standard, right? In the same way that the early internet protocol standardized, like how do you send messages between different servers, like we are standardizing what it means to be an IP. And so that's what the sort of nouns or the stuff of the protocol consists of, this database with a standardized way of storing IP and representing it. And then the verbs are kind of the modules that allow you to do interesting things with that IP once it's registered on Story. So once you've stored your IP in our sort of data structure, we have like a whole sort of menu of functionality that you can pull from. So you can set your licensing terms. You can allow people to pay you royalties, right? You can allow people to generate licenses, tradable or untradable licenses for your IP, right? And so now there's this whole universe of things that you can do, that you can program into your IP, that just wasn't possible before. And we handle the communication with the legal side. So that's really what we're doing. And that's why we call it programmable IP, because it's almost like your IP becomes a piece of software and it can flow through different apps. So that's another thing. It's not just, one app using this. It's like if I create a character on a creator tool that's registered a story, I can,
Mm-hmm.
any other app can pull from that library of IP. So it solves the cold start problem for these apps where, each app can register to and pull from the same global pool of IP that lives on the internet. And there's this composability to the Lego. So there's not just isolated databases living in each app. It's this global sort of network of apps.
Interesting. And I'm going to now ask you an unfair question in the sense that it might be out of scope of what your team is building. I get the J.K. Rowling analogy or example you gave. And to me, that works brilliantly. I can see if Rowling authorizes anyone to use Harry Potter given certain parameters and sets the terms, then I can go make some movie of, yeah, also buy the right to use Star Wars and X-Wing, and I create some little video of Harry Potter in an X-Wing destroying a Death Star, right? Something crazy like that. And I can see in that, I can see how your network, the IP marketplace, enables me to do that. And it's a win-win for everyone. One thing I'm struggling with, and this might be outside of scope, but I'm trying to get my arms around it, is another big problem is creators have their work ingested into these large language models to train AI. And then what comes out the other ends, it's hard to tie back to the original creators, right? So like book authors, for instance, objected to, like I have a couple books in there myself on the database. I know a couple of my books have been fed into this massive cauldron of original content that OpenAI has used to then spit out answers when folks ask it questions. And it's hard to tell if someone asks, like I wrote a book about Alexander Hamilton, right? If someone in the future asks OpenAI about Alexander Hamilton, it's really hard to know, was the answer pegged to something it got out of my book or one of the other 50 books about Alexander Hamilton out there, right? So in part of and even the smartest minds in the field, to my understanding, aren't totally exactly sure what happens in the black box of these large language models. It's really hard to connect the inputs from the outputs, right? We put it all together, and the AI kind of like makes, in pattern recognition almost, uses always raw inputs to create an answer. Long-winded way of asking, I guess, how in the story IP infrastructure, given the challenge of that kind of rigmarole of inputs go in, rigmarole, outputs come out, we're not sure how they connect. How, even with blockchain, are you able to kind of sync up the original IP that goes in with what comes out on the other side?
Yeah, it's a really important question, and this is totally on scope. We actually have our apps that are building on Stories infrastructure that are essentially trying to answer this question today. And so, for example, we have an app that is creating these character models. And so, character AI, other apps that one of the biggest consumer use cases for AI is like talking to characters, right? And so what happens is we actually store, not only the data used to train or fine tune that character model from like a base model on Story, but also the models themselves are stored as IPs on Story. So let me walk you through like how we can actually shape or reshape the AI training and output process end to end at every step of the way, not just the inputs, the training data, not just the model itself, but also the outputs as well. So what happens is if there's fine tuning data that character model is trained on, whether it's a prompt or some additional, text data that is trained on, that's stored on Story. And then anyone can look at what are the terms for me to use that fine tuning data, right? So anyone can create a model that's fine tuned talking about that data, but now there's a link between that data and that model on Story. So the model itself is a derivative of that data in some ways, right? Because it's using that data. And so now, okay, so I've registered the data, I've set my terms. Anyone can create a fine tuned model as long as they meet those terms. And anyone who uses the model, right, if they use the model to create some output and that output generates revenue, then it would flow through the entire graph. So the model creator would earn a portion based on the terms that they set, and then the original data provider would earn the rest of the portion based on the terms that the original data provider had set. And so you have this graph-like structure that's already being built where the initial data that's being trained on, the model itself, and then any of the outputs are all registered on Story. And if money comes in from any of the outputs, let's say someone creates a poem and mints it as an NFT, or licenses it out to someone to create some sort of story around it, and that generates $1,000, that would flow obviously to the person who created that, but also to the model creator as well as the original data provider, right? And so the idea is that end to end, this entire process can become explicit through Story's rails based on the price that creators set for their own data, for their own models, and for their outputs as well. So that's kind of the vision. And now that might sound very grandiose, but I would actually say that, the way that we're approaching this problem is very pragmatic, which is that the reality is all of the internet's basically been scraped, right? Like Common Crawl exists. And in my opinion, from my time at DeepMind and just kind of staying connected with the AI world, it's that basically this sort of pre-training, which is taking this internet scale data and building a model on it, that pre-training is more or less commoditized. So yes, OpenAI's base model might be a little better than, let's say, Llama, but at the end of the day, like, they're quite comparable. Where the alpha and where the value is going to increasingly accrue is on the fine tuning side, which is, let's say I'm Drake. My voice is out there, right? But what if you could fine tune a model on my voice? Or I have some specific data like on my hard drive that isn't scraped by the internet, and I'm a famous artist. Like, what if I could create a model that I own and that is trained on my data? Or if I don't want to create that model, people can create that model for me, but I set the terms for what their models must follow, right? And so I think more and more of the value is going to accrue to this fine-tuning layer. And that's where Story is like perfectly suited to provide value for creators and for remixers, as we talked about in the JK Rowling example. And so ultimately what this amounts to is, I think if you were to just visualize like a 2x2 graph where one of the axes is sort of open versus closed, and the other axis is high value capture versus no value capture. Right now, we're only seeing activity in two quadrants, right? The first quadrant is where most of the activity is happening, and it's very closed with high value capture. That's kind of one quadrant. That's where I would put OpenAI. That's where I'd put Anthropic. That's where I'd put most of these large model companies, these foundation model companies, where they're scraping the internet. You don't really know what data they're using, and they're charging you for the internet data that they're using. And yeah, they're generating lots of revenue. They're very successful businesses. But if they succeed in the long run, they will lead to this, walled garden, tragically common situation where, classic problem economics where like, OpenAI is training on Yelp data or Reddit data or Quora data. And in some cases they're paying for it, but in other cases they're not. Regardless whether they're paying for it or not, like the whole point is that people will stop visiting the Quora website. They'll stop visiting Yelp. They're just going to go straight to ChatGPT or Perplexity and get the answer, right? And so it doesn't matter if Quora is getting paid, but if I'm a Quora user and no one's actually reading my content, if I'm a travel blogger and no one's actually reading my content, I'm not going to do that anymore. And so you have this, green field, this commons of the internet that is being kind of manipulated, and there's no seeds to kind of reinvigorate it over time. Because, it doesn't matter if Quora, the company, or Reddit, the company, is getting compensated. I, as a Redditor, don't care because no one's reading my stuff. And so I'm going to stop creating stuff. And so if you're a model creator, even if you're OpenAI or Anthropic, you're in this bottom right corner, you should be really concerned because your own data sources are cannibalizing itself. And that's what I mean when I say, AI is eating its own tail, because these AI companies are arbitraging a situation that ultimately in the long run is unsustainable, and it's going to lead to a local maximum in the types of data that we get, right? And so that doesn't seem sustainable in this closed high value capture world. But on the other hand, there's this sort of open but no value capture world, right? So you're on the other opposite side of this quadrant where you have like Meta, right? And so they're okay with capturing no value, and they're okay with open sourcing everything because that's part of their business strategy, and they have, to say the least, they have other revenue drivers, right? And so that doesn't seem sustainable unless you want to be patronized by the goodwill of Meta, right? And so what we're trying to do is move to, let's say, the upper right quadrant where you have openness but also value capture, and we believe that happens by creating these win-win situations powered by programmable IP.
The vision you just described sounds fascinating and compelling. It also sounds really freaking hard. So I'm curious about how you envision rollout and adoption, and where do you see it starting? One reason I was so excited to talk to you is that you guys are actually building this. It's not just a whiteboard concept. You obviously have raised a considerable amount of capital and are deploying it smartly to actually build this, right? This isn't, you're intending to really do it. I'm guessing you're not going to start with my kind of cockamamie idea of DC and Marvel using this to hatch out deals together, right? Where do you see it starting? Where will it most be used? And then, kind of, if you can give us a timeline or overall sense of how you envision it rolling out and growing to a robust enough infrastructure that one day you might be able to have Superman and Iron Man hanging out together thanks to this kind of marketplace of IP.
It's a great question, and it's kind of the crux of what I think about every day at Stories. We're building this infrastructure layer, but it's really a public good in some ways, right? It's a public good in the sense of, if you ask, how do I use Story? Like, we're building tools, so it's like asking how do I use Stripe? Well, you have to kind of check out somewhere, right? So where's that storefront that you're checking out from? And so what I think about a lot is ultimately, what we can do is we can bring the best IP onto Story, whether that's native, like brand new IP created on Story, or whether that's existing IPs that are already popular moving on. That's one big area of focus. So we have some AAA Hollywood creators we haven't announced yet, but very, very large names that have created very large franchises that are building brand new worlds.
You can announce it right here, Jason. Feel free.
I wish.
Feel free to
share. Maybe next time. But basically, we have some pretty big creators that, they did it for a studio and now they want to do it for themselves and with their community. So they're going to bootstrap a lot of great content, and that great content is going to be appealing. People are going to want to use that content, whether it's native on Story, whether it comes from somewhere else and it's imported onto Story. That's really important. Having great content is important. If you're Netflix and you have the great AI recommendation algorithm, but every show actually sucks, like, no one cares about your AI, right? So that content bootstrapping problem and creator bootstrapping problem is one question, and then the other is, how do we get developers to build brand new consumer applications? Like I said, I think there's a lot of companies that are already integrating us that have already existed before, and we're really excited by that. We have apps that have creator tools that have 2.5 million users, and none of them are crypto users. They're all just sort of like traditional media users, and all these artists are generating art that's being registered on Story. But I think just as exciting is this new wave of entrepreneurs and developers that are going to build new apps build on top of Story that just completely have this IP Lego paradigm at their center and completely reshape what we think about when we think about media. And so, there's already some apps and entrepreneurs that have built on top of Story that have raised venture funding themselves to be sustainable businesses using our infrastructure. So it's about getting the best builders and the best artists together and having that magic happen. And ultimately it culminates, I think it happens slowly and then all at once, right? This is solving the cold start problem. We just need to have one hit, right? We have one killer app, one killer IP, and that's the proof of existence, right? That's what people need to see to be convinced, and that's fair. And so we're working really hard to find that proof of existence where, we do have things working now, but like really want to hit runaway adoption where, if you don't care about Story, if you don't care about AI, you just want to consume good content, or you're just using a consumer app, like it's actually hidden, like secretly powered by Story, right? And then we can go around and tell developers and creators that, hey, look, this works at mass scale, and the next Marvel, the next Harry Potter, the next big consumer app, it's all going to start using these tools. So it's very much a sort of slowly and then all of a sudden effect that we're driving towards.
Amazing. And last couple questions for you as we wind down. Circling back to one thing I was getting to earlier, let's say this all plays out the way you hope. It all works. You conquer all these very difficult challenges. It all works. I'm an executive at Warner Brothers or Disney 5 years from now, 10 years from now, whatever it is. How does the world look different? How does this kind of change the landscape even of Hollywood? What is the how does the world look differently with this kind of story IP network?
I think that your job almost looks a little bit of like a hybrid of a venture capitalist in some ways, or an investor and a community manager. And the reason I say that is because right now Warner Brothers is vertically integrated for the most part, right? Like they're kind of building everything in house. They own the IP. They're paying artists. They're paying producers, directors, right? And they're paying them for their labor, and then they're taking the IP and owning that as an asset, and then distributing it. And it's a siloed vertical approach, right? And that's kind of what's not working. This is kind of the problems we alluded to. What would work and what story enables is maybe Warner Bros. Seeds like 5 ideas, right? They put some basic world Bible out there. They put some canonical stories on Story Protocol. They put some canonical characters, right? And then they see which sticks. They see what people really like to contribute to, and they allow people to have skin in the game as well. They allow people, just like an entrepreneur would give equity, right? Or like some sort of upside to their early employees, right? I think that Warner Brothers should give the rights to, build remixes for each of these 5 foundational IPs to their community and see which one really takes off. And maybe all of them take off. Maybe that's great. But the whole point is you're seeding these ideas. You're encouraging and managing people to build on top of them in an open way, in an organic way, and then seeing what really reaches the escape velocity in terms of network effects. So I think the next generation of content hits, the next sort of like founding myths of entertainment are going to be open. They're going to be, almost going back to the oral tradition of like telling stories around a campfire. Like people just kind of remix and add their own twist. But unlike the oral tradition, like there's actually a system where you can capture value from that, where you can get rewarded for those contributions. So the IP is going to take on a life of its own rather than being shepherded and siloed and vertically integrated.
I have 1,000 more questions for you on this. It's fascinating stuff. We'll have to have you back for a sequel to unpack more what this future could look like. But the last question I'll ask for you that I ask all my guests: how are you using AI in your own personal life, whether for work productivity or just for funsies and fun and games?
Yeah, I think I use it for a lot of, sort of technical breakdowns and sort of abstract, I've had abstract technical ideas I want to translate very quickly. Like I use that. But I think the more interesting thing that I do with AI is that if I'm going to write something on an idea, or if I have a thesis about the world that I think is unique, I ask AI what it thinks. I'm not going to tell them my thesis. I'm going to ask it what it thinks about the same question. And if it has the same answer as I do, then I know that that is not unique. I know that my ideas are already out there. And so before you write the next blog post, or before you think you've reached the next new idea, I would argue that AI is currently a better representative of what's already out there. So real innovation, real scarce insights are insights that AI cannot reproduce. And so I would say that's a good way to stress test the quality and sort of uniqueness of your own ideas and philosophies.
Jason, great nugget to land on to leave us with. That was great. I so enjoyed talking to you. What you guys are building is fascinating. These are obviously massive structural problems you are trying to address. I think you guys have one of the more interesting projects out there. I'll be rooting for you. Thanks again, and best of luck to you.
Hey, thanks, Jeff. This was great. Appreciate it.
There you have it. Thanks again to Jason Zhao, co-founder of Story Protocol. And thank you to you, dear listeners. Hope you enjoyed. I think it's super fun to talk to folks who are building solutions in the AI space. There are a lot of problems out there. I am an optimist at heart. I think that there are solutions, and fun to see the team that's building them. As always, please subscribe, rate it 5 stars, forward to a friend, forward it to your partner, your partner's dog groomer. Thanks again, and see you next time.